In the first video, we didn't get much done on the truck. Okay, we didn't get anything done on the truck. There's a lot of important stuff to do to make the truck drivable and decrease its likelihood to kill me down to acceptable levels. Stuff like this, or any of these. So which should we start with? That's right, the least important one. I started the headlights late one night because I wanted to work on something easy that didn't involve jacking a 5,000-pound vehicle above me. Making that list was overwhelming. We need an easy win here. The headlights ended up being pretty neatly designed. Also, everything is coarse threads and in freedom units, as it should be. There's a metal bezel and a ring around the bulb itself, and the eyelid is sandwiched in between. I'd really love to meet the person who bought these. According to Summit Racing, they give your ride a new, stylish look that's different from everyone else. Unique? Maybe. Stylish? No. Even before the rust took over. So the rust stained the bulb, which would have been a lot worse if they weren't made from actual glass, which is wild, but it cleaned up really easily with some glass cleaner. I feel like I'm going to get a lot of use out of this can of spray paint in this build. It's not going to be a show truck. I'm not even going to paint the body. Some quick sanding and a layer of black and I'm calling it good. Pretty sure I'm going to end up doing this on probably every small part I take off the truck. Future me can worry about nice paint when my future children and I do a frame-off restoration in 2040. If you're not familiar with poka-yoke, it's a Japanese word meaning avoid blunders. It's a design principle that prevents inadvertent errors made by workers performing a process, usually a repetitive one. That can be accomplished by many ways through an interference fit, a visual notation of the correct way, an automatic alert on the manufacturing line. Basically, good engineers design parts so they can only go on in one direction. Foolproof. Here, we can see a bad engineer trying to install it all three incorrect possible ways first before finding the right one. I'm a quick learner though. I got it right on the first try on the other headlight. I'm so fast the paint didn't even have time to dry. I also didn't wait for the paint to dry. 10 minutes well spent for a major improvement to the visual look of the front end. The eyelids were subtle enough to not really be noticeable, but once you did, you couldn't unsee them. And hey, our first safety improvement. Before we start, I want to take a second to point out how not terrible these wheels are. Turns out hand-painted Chevy logos on rusty hubcaps are just a bad look. Also, new wheels are like $1,000, so I'm going to repeat that I don't hate these wheels until I manifest that energy into reality. The lugs are painted olive green. I don't know what to do with that information, but it's a layer of the onion of salvage repairs. Moving on to the steering. This is the steering column, which seems to be pretty directly connected to the steering wheel itself. That connects to the rack through a rag coupler, which is literally a fabric disc connecting a bolted metal end and a splined metal end, like a cheap U-joint. The internet says it dampens the steering too, but I feel like it's just going to end up being compliance in an already tough to steer vehicle. Anyway, this is the steering rack itself. The lash between the gears inside is adjustable from the top. I turned the screw all the way in both directions and it didn't affect the steering at all. Great. The output of the steering rack is the pitman arm. No idea why it's called that, but it's splined on one end and a ball joint on the other. I will end up buying and returning 3 of these before finding the right replacement. The pitman arm connects to the steering links. Nothing special there. The steering links are super tight, so that's good. Checking the column, and yep, it is definitely the rack. The rack is bolted to the frame from the inside. Pretty much everything else has lock washers, except these, which was an interesting choice. I ended up popping the rack out and propping it up on the frame rail and the steering links themselves while I tried to negotiate the splines off. I really wasn't planning on disassembling the rag joint, especially since it has such a convenient spline clamp for easy removal, but everything was pretty frozen on, so I guess we didn't need lock washers after all. But Here I have the rack disconnected, and now I can go wrestle the rag joint and the pitman arm off on the bench. Vintage truck restoration, sponsored by WD-40. Let's leave this overnight and come back to it in the morning. I got this Harbor Freight special pitman arm puller. I was certain I was going to crack it or strip the threads, and to make it harder as I'm trying to crank it loose, I'm using enough torque that I'm actually overcoming the gear ratio of the worm drive, and so the rack is rotating on the bench. I was even more certain after all this there was going to be no splines left on the pitman arm, but I was pleasantly surprised to be wrong about both. It worked great. Of course, this was all for nothing because I end up trashing both of these parts. I think they sell kits for these with all the seals and bearings that you need to rebuild it yourself, but that seemed like a lot of work, and there was an $85 core return on this hunk of junk, so I bought a new one. The first stage of hell on the rack install was trying to wrestle the whole thing back together. If you remember, I had a lot of help from gravity and a bucket during removal. Getting the splines inserted meant centering the wheel as best as I could and aiming for that position on the wheels and the rack. I think there's going to be enough compliance when I'm done that you won't really notice. You have to be moving to turn the wheels anyway, so it's not like you're watching the steering wheel. We're also not affecting the alignment of the wheels to each other, which is the really important part, since we aren't changing any of the lengths or positions of the steering links themselves. I finally got it all slotted together and realized that the ball joint side of the original pitman arm was shot. It's a taper pin that presses into the steering link, but it's not supposed to spin on the pitman arm side. I buy a new pitman arm on Rock Auto, and guess what? The splines don't match. Luckily, they have an awesome return policy, so I was only out the 3 or 4 days it took to ship. For take 2, let's try an auto parts store. I shipped the part to the store using my rewards points and a coupon code. I'm rolling. I'm smart enough to bring the old rack with me to test fit the part, figuring the old part fit on both racks, but most because I already had Loctited the new rack in. Remember, no lock washers. Anyway, you guessed it, the second part doesn't fit either. I point out that the part I bought is actually the power steering version that was mislabeled on the website. Blank stares. Why would anyone have manual steering? Side note, remember Pokeyoke? Incredibly handy that the splines don't match on the manual and power steering versions so you don't install the wrong arm accidentally. They send me to another location where a very nice lady on her first day patiently helps me test fit the correct part on the rack, and voila, it fits. She also says nice when she asks the model year, and I say 69. Nice indeed. Money well spent. I passed through the 7 levels of the candy cane forest, through the sea of swirly twirly gumdrops, and then travel up Pacific Coast Highway, only to install the new arm and find out that the super convenient clamp bolt on the rag joint is stripped. I'll speed up the video here so you can't tell exactly how long it took me to drill it out, but it was miserable. I overnight a new rag joint from Amazon, and we're not done yet. It arrives with only half the splines cut. By now, the importance of quality parts on a safety-critical subsystem has been overcome by my impatience. I'm an engineer. I bought the strongest bolt I could on McMaster and drilled out what's left of the threads to just install a lock nut instead. $30 later, and now I have 49 extra lock nuts, plus a tricked-out custom rag joint that gives my ride a new, stylish look that's different from everybody else. However, I do want to note that I did not get my rewards points credited back to my account during the second return. Remember, I said this paint can would get a lot of use. A couple touch-ups, paint pen the nuts so I can visually tell how close to death I am, and we're ready to test it out. I'm both very proud of myself and now very aware that the 3 new shiny parts are very obvious amid the rest of the rusty mess. Pretty damn good job centering the steering wheel, too, and the play in the wheel is now at normal 1960s levels. Infinitely better than before, and safe enough for me to drive and decide I want power steering after all. I barely got any footage of replacing the springs because it was one of the scariest things I've ever done, and I'm not ready to die on this YouTube channel just yet. Gotta get to at least 10 subscribers first. I tried spring compressors, but they didn't fit well, and honestly, it felt even more dangerous to have the energy stored like that. I ended up supporting the lower control arm with the floor jack to compress the spring while I loosened the ball joint. Keeping the castle nut on, I could whack the upper control arm until the taper popped loose. The nut prevents the whole thing from exploding off the jack and taking your hand off. With the floor jack carefully applying tension after it's loose, then you can remove the nut and gently lower the jack to relieve the spring tension. Terrifying, but uneventful. This probably doesn't work as well on modern cars, but everything on this truck is steel and ridiculously oversized for 3/4 ton loads, which makes it both easy and also physically hard to work on. Side note, I think I'll do a whole video on how this experiment worked out, but I ended up 3D printing a replacement ball joint boot because it couldn't be worse than this, right? Anyway, I only added springs to my Rock Auto cart because they were cheap, and I figured I'd do them eventually, and I'm glad I did. For one, I didn't realize how low the front sat until I started editing videos, and second, it turns out one of the springs was totally collapsed. Yikes. Dampers were significantly easier in principle, and then basically just as hard in practice. They're separate from the springs, which is great. However, the stock ones have an integrated stud that has a nut on the inside of the frame. Thank you, Chevy engineers. These are deep behind the shifter and the exhaust and basically everything in the engine bay, and they're also torqued down to 140 foot-pounds. I was about to take the exhaust off, which is probably how you're supposed to do it, but my exhaust has a handy dent that allowed me to undo the nut one ratchet click at a time, almost like someone's been in here before. The new dampers have a double-sided stud that gets torqued first, and then the damper is secured to that with a nut. So while I had the same challenge in reverse of torquing it down one ratchet click at a time, now I can replace the dampers super easily in the future. Speaking of ease, look at this idiot swinging a hammer. What I thought was a wire bundle was actually a pretty stiff metal sleeve housing the speedometer cable. Flip that little dude around and boom, tons of clearance. Another hint of mechanics from Christmas past, there's a big wear spot on the rubber overcoat from the damper. Anyway, the old dampers are out, they're quite nasty, and they don't seem to damp out anything or even rebound at all. Maybe all the fluid and gas have just leaked out? We'll put this in the box of things we're going to cut apart in a future video to see what's inside. A lot of this video was filmed during a hurricane, which was fun because I got to see where all the leaky spots of my new-to-me house are. LA doesn't believe in gutters, so that one rainy week per year is just extra annoying because gutters are pretty great. I fashioned myself a break wall and stuffed it with leaves to seal it, figuring if it was good enough for the beavers, it's good enough for me. Rain is such a novelty now that I find myself taking videos of things I previously found very normal. Anyway, definitely spring for the wax option at the car wash because that stuff works great. There was also an earthquake during the hurricane, which I was underneath the truck for while it was suspended by Harbor Freight jack stands, thus fulfilling a long-standing nightmare I've had. Still, it wasn't as scary as the violence of the ball joints releasing, which I still can't believe I didn't get on video. So the truck is sitting at a normal height now, and it should handle a lot better. That's good. I was a little frustrated that everything I dug into seemed to lead to more things that I need to dig into, but doing springs, struts, and steering for a couple $100 is well worth the effort. The next items on the suspension list are the tires, the upper ball joints in the front, and the rear dampers. The tires are pretty dry rotted, and they're also laughably small, so that's a must. I've been waffling pretty hard about what size to get, mostly because I don't want to impact the steering feel or lack thereof. The front upper ball joints I really should have replaced this go around, but you need an air chisel or something to get them out. The stock ones are welded, the aftermarket ones are bolt-on, so that dropped on the to-do list. And then because the front dampers were so easy, I figure we should just do the rear dampers. It definitely bounces around a lot more in the rear. We already have the parts, we just need to find the time to do that. It never ends. If you're still watching, leave a comment, tell me what you liked and you didn't like. If you want to see stuff like how parts on the truck work, 3D printing, the costs involved with the truck, thinking about working those topics in. I'm having a lot of fun making these videos, but likes, comments, subscribers are all really motivational for an early channel, so keep them coming.